Hi, my name is Eileen and I grew up in the 1960s in Australia. This means that I grew up in the hot weather with no rights for women or Indigenous Australians. The 1960s were a decade of political and social upheaval in Australia. The traditional values of generations before was challenged and changed. Women demanded equal rights and many others called for Indigenous Australians to be considered equal. There was a call for consideration to the environment and protests against things like Vietnam War and conscription. Women during the 1960s felt there was more to life than raising children, doing housework and being confined to female jobs such as teaching, administration and secretarial work. Many women protested and pressured governments to try and gain equal rights. The contraceptive pill was also introduced to Australia in the 1960s, and that gave women the opportunity to control when and if they had children. The pill also sparked controversy about premarital sex and promiscuity. In the 1967 referendum, Australians voted to recognise Indigenous peoples as citizens and allow them to be counted in the Australian population. This resulted in a large campaign of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. During the 1960s, many young people became delusional by what they thought was shallow and materialistic in society. This is what created the hippie movement. The hippie movement included rebellious clothes, Eastern spiritual philosophy, and experimentation with drugs like marijuana and LSD. New fashions, hairstyles, and types of music were created that show a sense of peace and relaxation. War broke out between Communist North Vietnam and Democratic South Vietnam in 1959. America and their allies, which included Australia, sent thousands of troops to Vietnam in an effort to try and stop the spread of communism. Many of the troops sent over had been conscripted, which means that their military service was compulsory. Many Australians hated the idea of conscription, so they constructed protests against the government to stop it happening. Robert Menzies was the president in Australia until his retirement in January 1966. Harold Holt replaced him. On the 17th of December 1967, Harold Holt went swimming at Cheviot Beach in Victoria. He was never seen again and was presumed dead 2 days later. His body has never since been found. After Holt disappeared, John Gorton was elected as the new Prime Minister in 1968. Gorton announced that no more Australian troops would be sent to Vietnam. Television was developed throughout the 1960s with more and more TV shows being created. By 1965, it was estimated that 9 out of 10 families owned TV. Programs from overseas were enjoyed widely throughout Australia, especially soaps like Coronation Street from Britain and comedies like Leave It to Lucy from America. There were music shows like Bandstand that were popular with teenagers, and shows like Play School and Mr. Squiggle were for the younger children. Programs like Homicide and The Mavis Brampston Show were turning points in Australian history. Their success showed that Australian audiences wanted to watch local-made TV shows. In the late 1960s, the television was connected up to the international satellite system. This could allow us all to watch the first moon landing in 1969. Cinema in the 60s was aimed more at teenagers of the decade. Films like Sundance Kid and Easy Rider reflected the fashion and music of the decade. The craze that was all throughout the 1960s on the radio was rock and roll. People would gather in dance halls for discos and do dance moves like the stomp, boogaloo and the twist. Some of the biggest boy bands toured in Australia, including the Beach Boys, the Rolling Stones, and in 1964, the Beatles. Australia was gripped by Beatlemania. Australia was mainly dominated in the music industry by America and Britain. The Seekers were an Australian band that were very successful. One of their songs was Georgie Girl. By the late 1960s, the American psychedelic and acid rock had spread over into Australia. The lyrics spoke of peace and tranquility. The fashion in the 1960s was a big change from past traditions. Miniskirts were introduced, as well as the hippie clothes. There was a more bold approach to clothes, with bright fabrics, even using materials like PVC and vinyl.
So shed those dowdy feathers and fly.